Hello everyone, Jessica Shire here and welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing another guest design for the Hedgehog Hollow using the August 2019 monthly kit. This time I'm going to be stamping on some yellow cardstock. This is one of those colored cardstocks that came in the kit, and I thought it would be kind of fun just to color using those Nuvo alcohol markers over the top. So in the first video I did, I'll have that linked below if you missed out on it, I did use some Distress Oxide ink over another, like a pink tone, coral tone colored cardstock, and I had a lot of fun doing that. So this time I'll be using some of the smaller leaf stamps, which is part of the bud stamp set that came in the monthly kit. So I'm going to speed this up a bit because it's just a lot of stamping and going back and forth. I think it's cool to see how a pattern background comes together. And one thing I like to do is make sure I get a lot of images hanging off the edges. So I do take quite a few of the stamps again and then restamp them just so that there's partial stamps so they're still hanging off the edge of that cardstock. So once I have all my leaves stamped, and there is that one really cool stamp that has a branch and then you can add leaves to it. I just love that one. I want to play with that one again. But I'm going to add some more leaves, but these are the singular ones. And they're solid, so they're filled in. I'm going to do some heat embossing. So I went ahead and I took a Brutus Monroe embossing bag that has a powder in it. And this just creates a very anti-static area so that the embossing powder doesn't stick where it shouldn't. Sometimes it'll stick to like your fingerprints. And for this, I'm going to actually just hand stamp with an acrylic block. So I'm going to pounce that stamp onto the embossing ink. This one I'm using the Brutus Monroe clear embossing ink. And I have two different sizes. There's a smaller one and a larger one. And a few of them I do group together to make like a 2-leaf image. I'm trying to do this as quickly as possible because I don't want that ink to dry or else it won't take, the embossing powder won't stick to it. But once I have enough coverage, I go ahead and I cover the entire panel with that gilded embossing powder, which is really pretty. And there was just a little bit of a smudge there. I think it's probably from my fingerprints or something. And that embossing powder stuck to it. I just wipe it away with a paintbrush. Now I can heat up my heat gun really well and start melting that embossing powder. I just love the way this looks while it's melting. And it melts really quick, so be very careful. Keep that heat gun moving, and because it will kind of bubble if you leave it on too long and warp it. I always move it around just slightly to make sure I have all of that embossing powder melted. It'll be like more matte, and it will kind of have that powder texture still if it's not melted all the way. I can just hit a couple of those areas real quick to make sure it's all melted. I still have a lot of that embossing powder that from that bag on there, so I use a makeup brush. I kind of sweep that away, or I rub my hands over it to get most of that off. So I'm going to use those greens again from the Lucky Clover alcohol pen set. And I'll zoom you in just a moment so you can see the coloring a bit better. But one thing I tried to do was use that light gray, that feather gray Nuvo marker for a lot of the shading. Since my paper is yellow, I can shade out to that yellow colored cardstock. And I use that gray marker to help do that. And it also gives it a darker tone than the background of the paper. So it's just a slightly different colored yellow. That's kind of a good tip to help stretch your markers if you don't have very many of them. So I'm basically going to do the same to all of those leaves, making sure to start with a darker green, blend out with the medium and the light, and then that gray tone. For some of the smaller ones, I skip a few of the markers just because it's hard to blend 3 markers in such a tiny area. And then for the berries and the buds, I decided to make them the coral. That's the other set that came in the August kit. These colored beautifully over that yellow cardstock. For the little berries, I just went with the darker and a lighter to give a really nice good contrast. But for the larger bud stamps, I decided to do the darker, the medium, and then the lighter, and then do the same thing as I did with the leaves, blend out with that gray, that feathered gray, light gray marker. Just makes for like a really cool contrast, I think. I also take the blending pen and go back through the entire panel and make sure I get all those little spots that I kind of went out of lines. And I took the large bloom set. I'm going to use a couple of the sentiments out of that set. This one says, "Just because," and "You're amazing." I stamped those with some clear embossing ink onto some black cardstock, using some white embossing powder over the top, just kind of like I did with that gold embossing powder in my floral background. I'm going to heat set that, and then I cut those down to where they're a sentiment strip and then like a bubbled kind of a fussy cutting around the "just because." And then I can trim down my background pattern to 4 inches by 5 1/4. So I'm going to use some of that vellum from the box. I decided to make it like a pocket for this cardstock to sit into. That way I didn't have to worry so much about where the glue is because of that vellum. It will show right through. So I went ahead and I kind of figured out where I wanted that vellum to sit on my cardstock piece. And then I used my Martha Stewart scoreboard. I don't think this is available anymore, but any scoreboard that you have or any way you score, you can just score right up to that edge of the cardstock on both sides, create like a triangle, and then I just snip off the rest of that bit of vellum at the very top that I don't need. And then I can crease those down, add some adhesive, and my cardstock will fit right back into that little slot. And then all I have to do is gently fold down the edges and it sticks to my little panel. I do have a little tiny piece that's still overhanging. I'm just going to snip that off, but I think that looks pretty cool. It's like a little pocket. It still pops up a little bit, but since I'm going to add the sentiments over the top of that vellum, that'll help hold that down. So I just add some liquid glue to those. And I can also add some more liquid glue behind the "just because" sentiment and behind the vellum to where nobody will see it. That will also help hold down that vellum. I'm going to set those underneath an acrylic block to dry after mounting it to another piece of that colored layering cardstock from the box. This is the blue one. I thought that one just kind of added to my Christmassy winter vibe that I had going on. And I'm going to use one of the card bases that come in the kit and use my scoreboard to score down the center to make a A2 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 card base. Now all I have to do is mount that card panel to the card base. And for a final touch, I decided to add some embellishments from my stash. These are some like dome drops. They have a slightly greenish tint to them, and they're from the Buttons Galore Lucky Charms collection or package of sequins. So just a little added touch. You could get that look with a lot of different things like Nuvo drop. I had these and I like that green tint that they had. I thought it matched really well. So that is it for this card. I hope you enjoyed this. This was a lot of fun. I like that whole wintry look I was getting from these colors. And it was fun just to sit back and color and stamp a pattern background. Alright guys, that is it from me. Big thank you to Hedgehog Hollow for having me as a guest designer. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. Subscribe if you have not already. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it. I appreciate you watching, and I will see you in the next one. Meh, meh.